Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, and welcome to SUU Community Connect Learn from Home series, hosted by your community education program. My name is Natalie Christensen, and we are happy that you could join us today. Navigating Close Quarters is a program created to keep our community connected during this time of staying at home. We invite you to mute your connection if you're joining us on Zoom and type any questions you might have for the presenters in the chat box. See the mute and chat box options at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Also, for those of you joining us on Facebook Live, we welcome you to join the conversation as well. Today, our presenter is Todd Robert Petersen. He grew up in Portland, Oregon, and now teaches film studies and creative writing at Southern Utah University. Before academic life, he was an assistant program director for YMCA Camping Services in Oregon and Washington. Petersen's novel, Picnic in the Ruins, a crime novel set on the Arizona Strip, will come out in early 2021. Todd, welcome.
Hello. Well, so we should just dive right into it then.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, this is a presentation that I know is coming to people who are at a long kind of life of presentations to help you make it through staying home and working on everything else. And I think that we might be at a point where we're all hitting a little bit of digital exhaustion, where I know as a parent, I'm oftentimes like, get away from that screen, that's gonna rot your brain. And it's the same thing my parents told us about the television in the 70s and the 80s and all that kind of thing. And yet, with the situation that we find ourselves in, we have, this is kind of a lifeline for a lot of people, a way to make connections. Everybody in my family is using some kind of digital tool of connection. Earlier in the day, my wife was on a massive Google chat call with other brothers and sisters, and my 9-year-old connects in a sort of a wild way online. My 2 teenage kids message each other back and forth with Instagram, share a lot of stuff. And so I kind of wanted to acknowledge right from the get-go that maybe we're all tired with this kind of thing. And I want to suggest some ways in which we might be able to, as we move forward. You know, we've moved from orange in the state to yellow. We don't know what the future holds. But I think that we're all going to kind of be emerging from our homes the way that we emerge from our homes in the winter. You know, if we were to go back a few months and it starts warming up and it's those first nice days, and we'll kind of come out of the house and start looking around. You know, maybe we'll be like those animals that have been captured and are released back in the wild, and maybe they're a little bit nervous to leave the cage to go back out there to the world. So those are some of the things that I want to talk about, but I want to talk about it almost as a second half or a bookend for the presentation that my wife gave a week ago about creativity and how people are using creativity to navigate the situations that they find themselves in at home. And so we spent a lot of time in the house talking about what was she going to talk about, what will I talk about to follow up to kind of help people with their creativity. So for a minute, I want to just kind of switch gears and throw up a little bit of a slideshow so that I can kind of point out that the conversation that we're having today is a conversation that's happening all over. And so I went to my own Twitter feed just earlier today because I wanted to make sure that it was all real. And I grabbed some things that were from recent and maybe from a little while ago, where other writers and artists were talking about how everybody's feeling about trying to be a creative person who's like trapped in the house with all kinds of different other people. So let me switch that screen around. And I'll have to rely on everybody. Do we have it there? Do we got rebooting your creative self?
That looks great.
Okay, so let's get started. I said we go to Twitter. I was going to go to Instagram first. There's a online friend. I've met him at a conference, but we've been friends for a long time on social media, Mitch Goldston. He teaches graphic design out in upstate New York. And he put out the left side over here on Instagram. I'll read it to help everybody if it's a little bit too tiny on the screen. I'm not taking forever to reply to your email because I don't care, says Mitch. I'm taking forever to reply to your email because I do care, but I'm having a very hard time concentrating and focusing enough to give your email the attention it deserves. This is not an excuse or a policy. It's simply a statement of, oops, and I typoed there, a fact about my current reality, and I suspect many others as well. And I think that frames like where we are and how we're trying to respond to each other. If it's difficult to give an email some care and attention, it can also be difficult to give creative projects that we're working on sometimes the attention that it needs. And Mitch has got a great thing in his Instagram feed. He puts out all kinds of ways of playing around with like Venn diagrams and other things. And I love how he's got us here thinking about, are we tired of quarantine, tired of quarantine, tired of quarantine? Yet we're right at that dark center where we're all kind of upset about this. Another Twitter friend of mine, the great and fantastic writer Amber Sparks, just said this today. Again, I'll read it because the type is a little bit small. My new novel, she says, will be titled, I Am Failing at Everything. And it will actually just be a moleskin notebook with a grocery list written on one page, another page where I tried out fancy pens, and a to-do list that includes write book. She follows up with, this is a lie. It will actually be a Midori grid notebook, but moleskin works better for the joke. Writers or people who are precious about notebooks will totally get that. Here's another from Amber in the form of a short little play with her child involved. Me, I need to work on my book today, honey. The 5-year-old. It's sure taking you a long time to write a book. Me, well, it's hard. 5-year-old. Maybe you should do something that's a little easier for you. Which is something that I've come across because I'm working on a book right now, and a lot of the last 2 months have been spent in that exact same conversation with my own kids. And then Amber talked a little bit about the difficulties of actually trying to write during the pandemic. And this is just this great video, and I watched the loop over and over again because it just says exactly how I feel about it all. Whoomp, 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 whoomp down the stairs. So this idea of talking to you about how do you kind of reactivate or reboot your creativity when a lot of us feel like this cat is exactly one of the things we should maybe be a little nervous about getting engaged with, but hopefully I've got some good answers and we can use some humor. A writer who's out in California, she's also wonderful, and a parent trying to make work from home work, says my 2-hour work time, quote unquote, ends in 37 minutes, and through the door I just heard screen time being taken away as a consequence, and now there's very loud screaming, and I may just climb out of the window and go buy cigarettes at the 7-Eleven, never to return. For which she follows up, for our next activity, Mommy will lie here as if dead, which I think is, it's humorous, and Lydia is hilarious on Twitter and in her own writing. But I think that there's something that's a little bit acute here, which is when we're trying to work at home and then also help with homeschool and then also try to manage all the other people in our home who are having a difficult time with the quarantine period or the lockdown or whatever we want to call it. Sometimes this idea of how much attention can we offer when we're at work, there's a little bit of an insulating factor from when we're doing our work in the office and when we're doing it at home. But when it's just right out the hall where the breakdowns and the difficulties are happening, it can make it difficult for us to engage ourselves. And so this is from a colleague of mine who says some really, really smart stuff. And so this is a tweet and the retweet of, this is a brilliant, devastating sum up of what I found so hard from working from home and pandemic parenting, which is a response to Jess Calarco's tweet. Exactly. It's never going to be able to give it's never being able to give anything my full attention that makes it feel like none of the time actually can. And so before I go on too far, and I've got a kind of background that I've staged up everything, I wanted to make sure that everybody saw that even during this, with my fancy plant and stickers and knickknacks behind me, this is what the space actually looks like. Right before we got started, I took that panorama and added it in so that you would know that, there's no weird Instagram perfection going on here. But in any case, what I wanted all of this social media posting to add up to was kind of best summarized in a recent New York Times article that says one of the difficult things for us when we parent, one of the difficult things for us when we work at home is that we got no flow. And flow, I'm talking about the psychological state, the state described by psychologists of being in a flow state. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that flow state is, but sometimes you hear athletes and other people talk about being in the zone. And one of the difficulties from working in close quarters with everybody else is it's very, very difficult to have the time to be able to get into that flow state. And the writer of this marvelous New York Times opinion piece, Jennifer Senior, said that our COVID-19 lives are a torrent of interruptions. And because we're constantly being interrupted, it feels like we're not being able to really tap into our creative selves. And so this flow state stuff that was sort of brought into play in the 70s by a psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He talked about, well, he graphed out the flow channel, which is what this diagram that I'm showing you here is, where on the left, kind of top to bottom, it talks about whether there's a high level of challenge in a task or a low level of challenge in a task. And then left to right, whether the skills necessary would be low level skills or high level skills. And he was able to kind of chart a channel where those A's are all kind of blocked in there. And something that takes a low level of skill, but is a high challenge, is anxiety inducing. And then similarly, something that takes a high level of skill, but a low level of challenge can create boredom. And so what we're looking for is a pathway through the middle. But there's an 8-channel version of this as well that talks about different tasks from high to low challenge level and low to high skill level that can say, hey, look, if it's low skill and kind of right in the middle, we're bored. And in fact, if it's low skill, low challenge, we get apathetic. If it's low skill, but sort of challenging, we worry. But what we're looking for is somewhere that matches that high level of challenge and high level of skill to get us into that flow state. But aside from the quality of challenge and the quality of skills that we need for flow, is we've got to have time. And many, many people have talked about it. Cal Newport has been one of the most interesting writers about this in his book, Deep Work, that without kind of long blocks of time, it's pretty difficult for us to settle into that flow state. And that flow state, you're probably familiar with it, at least every now and then. And that's when you lose a sense of time, maybe even lose a sense of yourself, and you're totally, totally flowing with whatever you're doing. And this isn't just art, but like I said, athletes have expressed falling into this state. Engineers, anybody who's got those challenges where they are able to do something that's of a high level of challenge and a high level of skill, and also some other things like they feel an intrinsic motivation to take part in this activity. It's not something that's forced upon them, and they get to kind of have some autonomy and make some choices in the tasks that they're under, and then people find themselves in that flow state. And this is where people report being the happiest. And so that's one of the things that's hitting us during this torrent of interruption that the New York Times opinion piece talks about. So wouldn't it be great if I was going to come to you and say, I have a solution for your flow problems while everybody is living in close quarters? I don't. But what I want to do is suggest tonight something that you can put into your life, and something I've been practicing as well, and we've been trying to get our kids here in this house to focus on instead of flow. And so that flow is just being present. And there's a lot of discussion about what it means to be present, but you'll find it in discussions of meditation and mindfulness. And so what I want to talk about for being present instead of flow is something I talk to my students at the university a lot, is sometimes when we're going through steps in a process, there's a step zero. And the step zero is what you have to do in order to be ready to do the thing you're going to do. So to be present, step zero is to make yourself available to the world. You have to say, hey, look, I'm ready to do this. Because if you're not, then the other steps aren't going to matter. But once you've decided, I am going to try to make myself present and available so that I can tap into my creativity, to my imagination, to my better sense of self, something I can do for myself instead of flow, which might take a couple of hours and I don't have it, you make yourself available. And that's really can just be by asserting it, but it also can be by telling other people, hey, I need 10 minutes, I need a half an hour, I'm going for a walk, I'm going for a drive, and you set that time aside. And then in order to be present with a sense of a creative mind, then step one is to observe. To be here, to be present in this world is to turn around from one side of your field of vision to the other and observe what is there, what is here. Because oftentimes when we feel anxious and when we feel worried, we're projecting into the future. We're starting to think about things that might happen, things that could go wrong. And during a distressing time like we have now, it's easy to let our thoughts move into the future. So you pull yourself back to the present by simply observing. But then the creative person is going to do something else, which is to capture that moment. And capturing that moment can take a lot of different ways. Some people pull out their phone and snap a picture. Some people take down a note. Some people make a mental note. And I want to talk a little bit later about why that's not really the best approach there is. And then they circle back and they do something with it later. So when you have time, when you have a break, you can, after you've observed and captured something, you can come back and work with it. And in a lot of ways, this is a model of creativity that others have called kind of the magpie style of creativity, where what you do is you gather shiny objects and then you bring them back and you can work with them later. So to talk about mindfulness, at least in the creative context, it's one thing to get yourself squared away, and it's maybe a little bit at odds against mindfulness to do something with your mindfulness, because oftentimes when you're talking about mindfulness in a meditation context, what they're saying is just be here now. But to engage your creativity is to say, after you've taken a period of mindfulness, then you're going to do something with it. And since a lot of this mindfulness stuff comes from kind of Eastern thinking, I thought that one of the things I would recommend for how to tap your creativity with mindfulness is to think a little bit about the haiku poem. And we probably learned this in school, and most people know that you do a little poem that has 5 syllables and then 7 syllables and 5 syllables. And that's the thing that gets people hung up the most, are those little standards. But what's so interesting about a haiku is where you're going to introduce an observation, explore it a little more, and then there's a change up or a reversal or a break. And we could talk about haiku all day long, but this is the basics. And so if what you're doing is to say, I'm going to make observations in the world, I want to be a little bit creative, then one of the things I work with my creative writing students at the university is to say, start by structuring with a haiku. It's relatively simple. But that simplicity can belie a much, much deeper and bigger and kind of awesome thing that can be done with just 3 lines. So here's one considered to be one of the great haikus from Basho. An old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond. See, that's the expansion. Splash, silence again, and that's the change. So this is something that's an observation that comes from a meditative moment. And another is this one from Hokusai. I write, erase, rewrite, erase again, and then a poppy blooms, which I think is a great way to talk about the creative process, where it begins with frustration and repetition until something amazing happens. And here's one that I wrote recently. God's great achievement is quiet. No 2 faces are identical. So what's the deal with a haiku? It allows you to go through that process where you make yourself available, make an observation, capture that observation, and then come back to it later and shape it and work it. And this is something that could be done with smaller chunks of time, which may not require the flow, which is so constantly disrupted by our current living situation. Another trick that you can do for your creativity, and this has been documented in a lot of creativity research, is to change it up. Grooves can become ruts. So if we're living just in a small home and we're moving back and forth across the same spaces, there's a lack of familiarity, which makes it difficult for us to engage in this new way and to be observational. Sometimes we go to the grocery store and we come back. Our movement's been really, really limited by the pandemic. So one of the recommendations I can make, and it sounds so silly, is once you make yourself available and you're going to run an errand, go a different direction, even if it takes longer. Move yourself down different streets. Now, some of the neuroscience on this is really interesting, that as you move through new places and you're seeing new things, you're taking your old thoughts into new spaces, and it kind of remaps the I'm losing the word, the connections in your brain, they remap to help you with the new space that you're in. And so by changing it up, doing things different, doing things in a different order, doing things backwards, taking on a chore or a task that you don't normally take on can have a profound effect on your own creativity, because you're not getting down into that rut, which is going to make your brain think in the same way. And that's one of the keys to creativity, is not just that you have tons and tons of thoughts, but that your thoughts vary, and that you can have a whole variety of ways and approaches to think about a thing. Another way that you can kind of help yourself is to bring yourself into the present moment. And like I said before, sometimes our natural instinct is to take a photo of something so that we remember it. But one of the activities I have done with students a lot, particularly when we were taking them out into the field and the national parks, sort of program that I was running for a while, we would ask them to purposefully and intentionally choose not to take a photograph of something, and instead try to turn it into language, try to figure out how you might tell someone. So we would ask them to do that through the day, and then later we would come in and say, okay, you guys, what was the photo that you did not take? So I want to tell you about 2 photos I did not take recently. When I was dropping my daughter off to go through everything to get ready for graduation at Cedar High, we came into the front doors, and there was a young woman with a baby and a baby carrier, and she was posing with the baby's dad to graduate from high school. And I thought, this is a whole amazing and profound story all in one moment. And it would have been wrong to just like grab a picture because I wanted to remember it. But what I did instead was think about the triumph of that young family getting ready for their graduation and everything that they were able to accomplish in this moment of the pandemic. This was a waterstone event for them. And so I think I actually think more about that moment because I didn't take a photo, because I didn't cleanly and easily file it away in my phone and forget about it. I was asking my brain to activate, to think about this young family and how amazing they were. Another one, I was up in a parking lot with my 9-year-old trying to get him some exercise. He was riding his bike on training wheels around, and we spied through the trees something that looked really weird, like a giant kite or a dragon. And so instead of just going and grabbing a picture of it, because it would have just been a black dot in the sky, we went into the car quickly, grabbed some binoculars, and my son and I looked at it. And what it was a long sheet of black plastic that had blown up in the wind from last week and was kind of flowing and roiling in the air like a big dragon. And so I went through the processes. I saw it, I noted it, I did not take a picture of it. And it's now working its way into a story that I had been thinking about a father and son who are traveling in rural China, and they find a dragon on the road that had been hit by another vehicle in front of them. And so there they were going, wow, we know that a dragon is alive. And now we have to help a dragon that's been run over, just like we see all the time when a deer or a cat or a rabbit has been hit. And so that's how, for me, a moment where was sort of available to whatever was out there can start working its way back into existing creative work. A lot of the ideas that are coming out in this presentation today are from this amazing book by Rob Walker called The Art of Noticing. And I picked this book up about a year ago, and it's so great. And I would just, if you are thinking about ways that you want to get yourself or your family to reconnect and to engage, this has little exercises that will say, hey, why don't you walk through the neighborhood and take a smell tour? Or why don't you go through the neighborhood and start to list all the things that you've heard? Or why don't you go into a space? He said that a friend of his always thinks about how would a crime occur in this space, because he thinks about that kind of stuff. And so that's a way to just sort of start to change up the way that you notice things. Because again, you may not have 2 or 3 hours, but you may have a moment. And sometimes a moment is enough to connect with our creativity. And then I would say go against the grain. This term came up when we were researching how to cut your own hair at our house. And one of the things they said to do with clippers was to go against the grain of your hair. But it got me thinking about how many times creativity is really just going in a different direction than everybody else is going. So in addition to taking a different route to the grocery store, go against the grain. If you like paintings, look at paintings that are different than the ones you normally like. Listen to music that's different than the music than you normally like. Read books that are different than the books that you normally like. The woman that I talked about, Amber Spark, was asking people just on Twitter today, what's a book that you love but isn't really your normal thing? And so I thought I would pull that back into this thing and say, hey, if you are trying to jumpstart or reboot your creativity, then maybe what you should do is just consciously go in a different direction. If you do not like murder mysteries, go grab an Agatha Christie novel or something like that. So that is the end of my slides and my recommendations. And what I would love to do now is switch back. I'll pause while it's doing it. And I can take questions that maybe have come through from the group, and we can talk about some of those ideas, or people can go, what are you talking about? I never have time to be peaceful and mindful or any of those things.
Well, yeah, let's give people some time to put their questions in now, things they would like. I do have a few questions that are coming through. Here's one second. What suggestions do you have to separate home from work?
Oh, I should ask that question to you. It's a really, really fantastic. And I guess, can I ask a follow-up before I answer it and see if we can get it? Are we talking about how to mentally separate the two activities, or to actually physically do it? I feel like they're
I'm guessing
maybe
mentally,
not the same thing.
But I think it could be both.
Mentally. I don't have a good answer for that, but I can talk about things that I've tried. My wife and I worked out schedules because we knew that each of us were going to need different times. And so something like the broadcast that we've done this week and last week, my wife took the kids out of the house. And so we worked together as a team to say, we know that kids around bedtime is not the best time for us to be working on this, because the door, people knock on the door, or people get their screen time taken away and melt down. So what we've done is we've kind of watched each other's backs, and we said, hey, if there's something coming up, I can clear people out. So that time that I was with my son and we saw the dragon plastic blowing in the air, that was me kind of clearing up some space for my wife, because she had a big meeting with state office of education people. And she's like, I just need everybody out of here. And so one of the things that we do is we offer that place. And I'll tell you one of the things that it does when you know that somebody's making a sacrifice for you, for your time, for your creativity. I find that I fritter that time a whole lot less than when I'm just whatever. So it's like, if the house has been cleared and I know that it's inconveniencing people, and in fact, when I know that I'm putting them out there in a world that puts them in a little bit of jeopardy, I better work. And so I start thinking about that different. And, you know, again, when it was winter and everybody was just sitting around, I'll go, well, I'm bored, click, check Twitter, what's on my Instagram, but I didn't do any of that. The other thing is sometimes you have to find different schedules. You know, we've all heard about circadian rhythms. That stuff is real. People have times when they're more functional and when they're less functional. And I know my good times of day. I know the afternoon, for example, is not a really good time for me to knuckle down and do real good creative work. I'm great first thing in the morning. I'm great in the evening. But there are times when it's better for me to meet with people, help things, go fix a bike, any of the things that fit into that space. So I kind of know my own landscape. And I wish I could say that I always got the opportunity to do my creative work at the time that I'm best at doing my creative work. And that doesn't happen. So what I've learned in order to get things done is to just accept a slightly lower state of awesome creative flow and just go with it. Because this spring, when I was doing copy edits on that book, Picnic in the Ruins, I mean, we knew that it had to be done. And what's wonderful is we even scheduled this, like when I was asked, hey, when can you do this? I said, the copy edits are due on the 27th. So I could do this the evening of the 27th. But I couldn't do it before then because that would be when that time is spent. But this morning at 9 o'clock, I emailed that off, and so the day was clear. So a lot of what I think it takes to set up for creativity feels like the least creative thing in the entire world. It's like the most stable and boring, just kind of ways of organizing your life, because I think a tempestuous life sometimes attracts a lot of my attention into solving the tempestuousness, the torrents of interruptions. And I like things to be really kind of boring and plain, and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if that's a really good answer, but that's at least what I've tried.
I think that that's very helpful. I think that's been something we've all been working with, is how to balance that. You talked, this kind of goes along with that question. You talked about breaking routine or getting out of the rut, right? But do you think it's possible that routine can ever help you create flow if it's the right balance?
Yes. I have found that when I can expect certain things, certain rhythms in the day, then I feel safer to drop into the flow channel, if that makes sense. So that diagonal thing that we saw. When I am worried, and my wife just said this to me the other day, she said, when you can't write when you think someone's going to knock on the door, even if they never knock. And so I think that having some measure, when you're knuckling down to the work, right? When I talked about it in those 0, 1, 2, 3 steps, circling back, that circling back step kind of demands, I think, that regularity. Or that routine. But for me, inspiration comes when I'm kind of breaking out against that routine. And so I think maybe that's the struggle of creativity, is you've got to have this routine to do the work, but you can't have really great ideas if you're just sitting at the desk doing the work. Mm-hmm. You have to go out into the world and experience it and think about it and meet people and eavesdrop on the conversations that they're having and see things that, you know, like that young family grouping that I was just thinking so much about. You don't encounter them from your office. And so I think that's all creative people have to be moving backwards and forwards across that threshold of their office door. Go out into the world and see things, come back and make something out of it, and then return. And then you go back and forth and back and forth.
That is wonderful. I appreciate that. Here, 1 second. We have another question coming in. Do you have advice for speaking to children, teens who are scared by all the news and statistics that are thrown everywhere?
Wow. Our family dynamic is really interesting. At dinner, we just hit it all head on. And we don't go into the to the grisly, gory details. But what my wife and I feel like we want to do is to be able to kind of help with all the spin. And so we'll say, hey, I noticed that this was trending on social media. Did anybody see this? And so now we have a dynamic, because again, we've got a 9-year-old, a daughter that's starting SUU this fall, and a son who's a sophomore at Cedar High. So we've got them kind of spread along. And what we've just been trying to do to help them with their calmness is give them the truth. And this is weird because we kind of caught that from all the lessons that we got from like how to be like maturation, right? Like, what do they teach parents during this time? Well, if they ask you a question, answer it and use the real terms, because if you don't, then they're going to go seeking for that answer from somewhere else. And maybe you don't want them getting that answer from someone else. So when we tried to talk about, you know, all the things that are really scary, we say, look, we're going to help you with, and this is the English teacher and me talking, we're going to help you with the information literacy learning outcome of this question. Does this feel like it's true? Can we go find evidence that is the opposite? Why don't we go to the health department website and get the real answer instead of the one that maybe you heard from some friends? And so for us, that's been, even though it's a little alarming to learn the truth sometimes, it's calming because we're not all out there in a thing. But what we've also done is had our kids be creative about it. Our daughter is a marvelous illustrator. And we've said, when you are older and when you're a mom or a grandma, if you have a visual journal of what happened during this time, it's going to be a treasure for people. So they have turned a little bit of their thinking about the COVID-19 and pandemic and lockdown in some great ways. My son made a public service announcement about the defeat of the COVID-19 virus in a little kind of comic book. And so they've all kind of turned that energy in a certain kind of productive way. I don't know that that'll work for everything. These poor kids of ours have an art teacher, professor mom, and a fiction writer, professor dad. And so they got no chance. We're always going to be dropping this stuff on them. When other people might go, let's go ride bikes or do sports, we're just a different kind of family.
Hey, if it's helping them work through it, then that is a great suggestion.
And
I have one more.
And that is a great question.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I was going to add, by bringing it up, it makes it not taboo if you're willing to just talk about it yourself. I know that there were times in my family that I didn't realize we could talk about something because it was never brought up. So bringing up the tough topics at the dinner table is probably really helpful. I have one more question.
And our 9-year-old is really articulate about it. And I think that's what I'd say. He was having a time when he was very, very upset, and he went through his list of things that he was upset about. And at the end, he's like, because it's the pandemic and I can't go out of the house and I haven't seen any of my friends. And we're like, okay, cool, we can work with that. He blew up, but we were so proud of him to be articulate like that. He's regularly articulate about lots of things, and anybody out there who knows that little boy is probably laughing right now. But yeah.
That's great. Being able to know why you feel that way and put it into words is a great skill. So I have one more question for you before we call it a night. Let me see here. I design things in my mind for weeks to months before I start a project. Is this a normal creative thinking?
Yes, but I want to say yes in a way that might be surprising. There's been some really interesting look at Darwin's notebooks. And there's a point in time when Darwin, and I should remember the date, and my friends who are scientists will be mad at me for not remembering the exact point. But there was a point in Darwin's journals, and he was a really great keeper of journals, where he said to himself, this is when I figured out that thing that would become his theory of evolution. He said he was reading Malthus, and he had this sort of amazing kind of moment. And then when people went back and looked through their journals, they're like, that's not even true. He had little bits and pieces of the idea. I don't know whether I'm doing the timeline left or right here. Bits and pieces of the idea long before he realized that he was assembling it into the idea. And so I like to tell my students that, yes, absolutely, that you may have this little kind of seed of an idea that's growing and growing and growing until it pops up through the soil. And it may have been working for a really, really long time before it becomes something. So if you're conscious of designing or planning or thinking about things for a long time, that's one thing that's really great. A lot of times, though, that's not happening at a conscious level at all. And one of the really interesting ideas is this concept of off-task problem solving, which happens sometimes to people when they're really relaxed, right? Like maybe they're taking a shower or they're exercising. My wife last week talked about what happens if you exercise to exhaustion and then kind of implement a creative idea, or just like doing something like doing the dishes. And all of a sudden, something springs to mind that's like, oh, this is this idea. It feels like inspiration. It feels fully formed, but that's because you got yourself in a relaxed state, maybe tapped into that flow a little bit. But then also you got into a situation where, boom, it can just, that idea feels like it can come out. And if anybody's interested in that idea kind of explored fully, Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic book and the TED Talk that she's got online are fantastic kind of entry points into what does she think about inspiration. Hint, it's a little bit of magic.
Well, thank you. I have one more thing to share with you. You got a shout out from James Sage and Melinda Thorpe on Facebook Live that you're a creative genius. So thank you.
Oh,
We
now
really
I'm gonna have to live up to that, huh?
What was that?
This was fantastic. Oh, now I'm gonna have to live up to that.
Well, nothing like a pandemic to bring out the best in us.
It's so great. And if I can give like a reverse shout out, when I was going through and checking things out and getting myself ready today, I saw so many amazing videos. So it's really cool that there's these online live events that can kind of bring people together virtually. I love that you have this library now of things. And I was just amazed at the number of really, really thoughtful and creative people that are in our community that I don't always get to run across. And so that was really cool. You guys are doing something pretty noble and marvelous at this point.
Well, thank you so much. And we really appreciate you adding your skill to this series. It has been wonderful. All of us at SUU Community Education truly hope you have enjoyed learning something new. You can watch the recording of this and all of our free online classes at suu.edu Keep Learning, or on our YouTube channel, Be Wise, Keep Learning. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next week for more lessons on navigating close quarters, reducing stress, parenting, and more. Have a great night.